Well, the African Continental Free Trade Area has great potential to be the continent's comeback strategy after the woes of the COVID-19 pandemic. But how far have we come with it, and is it even possible? Yavi Madurai is Executive Director of the Pan-African Businesswomen's Association, and she joins us now. Yavi, it's long been said that countries on the continent are not taking advantage of the opportunity to trade with each other. This is very much supposed to create some kind of pathway to be able to do that. Let's talk about how it has been explored under the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions.
Sure. So, hi, Cathy. So, we have got a legacy. Unfortunately, we have to talk about the legacy of colonialism that divided Africa from a trade perspective. So, first of all, when you compare that intra-Africa trade sits at, I think the maximum would be like 18 to 20% as compared to Europe, which sits at 70%. Obviously, Brexit's going to impact that. And Asia, which sits at about 60-65%. So obviously, there's a massive opportunity from an intra-Africa trade perspective. And the AfCFTA being one of the key pillars of Agenda 2063 and creating that unified opportunity, and especially from a trade perspective, COVID showed us the opportunity. So as much as it brought, so much devastation and economically, it just destroyed economies across the continent and around the world. But what it did do is that it showed us what we are able to do from a manufacturing, from a necessities perspective, and how things can move across the continent, even with restrictions. So obviously, when the AfCFTA then comes into effect, 1st of January 2021, and most of those restrictions start to fall away, that then starts to change the game immediately from an intra-Africa trade perspective.
Yavi, what are the barriers that have been identified that hinder the opportunity, so that prevent people from taking as much advantage of it as possible?
Sure. So there's quite a few. I won't take you through all of the detail, but I will give you some kind of inkling into what could be the main barriers. Some of those main barriers, as you can imagine, are things like documentation, governance, process, regulation, all of those kind. If you think about cross-border trade and stuff that needs to come into our country, for example, or stuff that needs to leave our country, you can imagine that the documentation is quite stringent for various reasons. Now, if you think about it, with 55 different states across the continent having different levels of governance and regulation, that just complicates things massively. So that's the first thing. The second thing is obviously looking at it from the perspective of things like customs, and customs becomes a massive issue obviously as well in terms of regulation and what is allowed through our borders, what is not allowed through our borders. So there's different things like origin of product. Where's the product made? What would be the circumstances around those products, in terms of things like that are manufactured in certain types of factories, health and safety. So we've got all of these regulations that would now need to be leveling of the playing field in order for 55 countries to technically start trading. That is going to change the game immensely. So there's lots of positives, but in terms of us to be able to get there, that's going to be quite the challenge and quite a journey in order for us to be able to truly benefit from the AfCFTA.
Yavi, would you say that there is a difference in the kind of barriers that produce from the continent faces versus what is coming from the rest of the world? And if there is a difference, what do you think is driving it?
So remember, we have different standards. Even across the world, we have different standards. I have to say that from a South African perspective, we're the most industrialized economy on the continent. We have the strongest infrastructure, and especially when it comes to, and I'm going to use a word that needs to be used, and that is the trust factor. So from a trust perspective, we've got a massive deficit on the continent just in general. In terms of South Africa, we do have the capacity to be able to use that strength in terms of more trust than most because of our industrialization, because of things like our manufacturing sector being quite strong. But remember, we have to increase and improve and do all of those kind of things in order to meet the potential. Now, to answer your question around what would be the differences, every country would have different regulations, different standards, and those kind of things. So obviously, when it hits our borders, there are certain things and certain standards and regulations that, if we send something to Nigeria or Kenya or wherever it is, and vice versa, what would be the standard minimum benchmarks that would be allowed, especially from a compliance, from a risk perspective, massively so. So these are the kind of things that would need to be looked at. And bear in mind, in order for us to go into a global trade scenario, which is the reason for the AfCFTA also, is that we need to be able to meet international benchmarks and standards as a continent, because we're the second largest free trade area in the world when we come together.
Yavi, very briefly, let's talk about the hashtag Trade Easier campaign.
Sure. So Trade Easier has been about looking, it's a partnership between the African Union Commission and UNCTAD, which is the Center for African Trade, and it looks at how do we start to trade easier, as simple as that. What are the things that are preventing us from being able to trade with each other? What are the things that allow us, so like the SADC region and ECOWAS, how do we start to now have simple ways or deal with the issues? One of the tools that have come out in all of this by UNCTAD and the African Union or the AU Trade Commission has been a monitoring tool for complaints around. So if you or I, as a small business, as well as a massive, large multinational, we have the same ability to be able to lay complaints, whether we're standing at the border, whether we're trying to push things through, via rail or freight, whatever it may be. So this tool is set to be able to create quite a difference, especially for the likes of small businesses, women-owned businesses, youth-owned businesses, and cross-border trade. And that is where there's 6 webinars that are happening for every region. And that is what Trade Easier is about. It's a movement around how do we start to remove the barriers to intra-Africa trade.
Yavi Madurai, thanks for your time on The Pulse today. It's been a pleasure chatting to you there. She is the Executive Director of the Pan-African Business Women's Association.